Chapter 12 of My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Religious Nature Awakened. Abolitionists spoken of. My eagerness to know what this word meant. My consultation of the dictionary. Incendiary information. How and where derived. The enigma solved. Nathaniel Turner's insurrection. The cholera religion, first awakened by a Methodist minister named Hanson. My dear and good old colored friend Lawson. His character and occupation. His influence over me. Our mutual attachment. The comfort I derived from his teaching. New hopes and aspirations. Heavenly light amidst earthly darkness. The two Irishmen on the wharf. Their conversation, how I learned to write, what were my aims. Whilst in the painful state of mind described in the foregoing chapter, almost regretting my very existence, because doomed to a life of bondage, so goaded and so wretched at times that I was even tempted to destroy my own life, I was yet keenly sensitive and eager to know any and everything that transpired having any relation to the subject of slavery. I was all ears, all eyes, whenever the word slave, slavery, dropped from the lips of any white person, and the occasions were not unfrequent when these words became leading ones in high social debate at our house. Every little while I could overhear Master Hugh or some of his company speaking with much warmth and excitement about abolitionists. Of who or what these were, I was totally ignorant. I found, however, that whatever they might be, they were most cordially hated and soundly abused by slaveholders of every grade. I very soon discovered, too, that slavery was in some sort under consideration whenever the abolitionists were alluded to. This made the term a very interesting one to me. If a slave, for instance, had made good his escape from slavery, it was generally alleged that he had been persuaded and assisted by the abolitionists. If also a slave killed his master, as was sometimes the case, or struck down his overseer, or set fire to his master's dwelling, or committed any violence or crime out of the common way, it was certain to be said that such a crime was the legitimate fruits of the abolition movement. Hearing such charges often repeated, I, naturally enough, received the impression that abolition, whatever else it might be, could not be unfriendly to the slave, nor very friendly to the slave holder. I therefore set about finding out, if possible, who and what the abolitionists were, and why they were so obnoxious to the slave holders. The dictionary afforded me very little help. It taught me that abolition was the act of abolishing, but it left me in ignorance at the very point where I most wanted information, and that was as to the thing to be abolished. A city newspaper, the Baltimore American, gave me the incendiary information denied me by the dictionary. In its columns I found that on a certain day a vast number of petitions and memorials had been presented to Congress, praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and for the abolition of the slave trade between the States of the Union. This was enough. The vindictive bitterness, the marked caution, the studied reserve, and the cumbrous ambiguity practiced by our white folks when alluding to this subject was now fully explained. Ever after that, when I heard the words abolition or abolition movement mentioned, I felt the matter one of a personal concern, and I drew near to listen when I could do so without seeming too solicitous and prying. There was hope in those words. Ever and anon, too, I could see some terrible denunciation of slavery in our papers, copied from abolition papers at the North, and the injustice of such denunciation commented on. These I read with avidity. I had a deep satisfaction in the thought that the rascality of slaveholders was not concealed from the eyes of the world, and that I was not alone in abhorring the cruelty and brutality of slavery. A still deeper train of thought was stirred. I saw that there was fear as well as rage in the manner of speaking of the abolitionists. The latter, therefore, I was compelled to regard as having some power in the country, and I felt that they might possibly succeed in their designs. When I met with a slave to whom I deemed it safe to talk on the subject, I would impart to him so much of the mystery as I had been able to penetrate. Thus the light of this grand movement broke in upon my mind by degrees, and I must say that, ignorant as I then was of the philosophy of that movement, I believed in it from the first, and I believed in it partly because I saw that it alarmed the consciences of slaveholders. The insurrection of Nathaniel Turner had been quelled, but the alarm and terror had not subsided. The cholera was on its way, and the thought was present that God was angry with the white people because of their slaveholding wickedness, and therefore his judgments were abroad in the land. It was impossible for me not to hope much from the abolition movement when I saw it supported by the Almighty and armed with death. Previous to my contemplation of the anti-slavery movement and its probable results, my mind had been seriously awakened to the subject of religion. I was not more than 13 years old when I felt the need of God as a father and protector. My religious nature was awakened by the preaching of a white Methodist minister named Hanson. He thought that all men, great and small, bond and free, were sinners in the sight of God, that they were by nature rebels against his government, and that they must repent of their sins and be reconciled to God through Christ. I cannot say that I had a very distinct notion of what was required of me, but one thing I knew very well: I was wretched, and had no means of making myself otherwise. Moreover, I knew that I could pray for light. I consulted a good colored man named Charles Johnson, and in tones of holy affection he told me to pray, and what to pray for. I was for weeks a poor, broken-hearted mourner, traveling through the darkness and misery of doubts and fears. I finally found that change of heart which comes by casting all one's care upon God, and by having faith in Jesus Christ as the Redeemer, Friend, and Savior of those who diligently seek Him. After this, I saw the world in a new light. I seemed to live in a new world, surrounded by new objects, and to be animated by new hopes and desires. I loved all mankind, slaveholders not excepted, though I abhorred slavery more than ever. My great concern was now to have the world converted. The desire for knowledge increased, and especially did I want a thorough acquaintance with the contents of the Bible. I have gathered scattered pages from this holy book from the filthy street gutters of Baltimore, and washed and dried them, that in the moments of my leisure I might get a word or two of wisdom from them. While thus religiously seeking knowledge, I became acquainted with a good old colored man named Lawson. A more devout man than he I never saw. He drove a dray for Mr. James Ramsey, the owner of a rope walk on Fells Point, Baltimore. This man not only prayed 3 times a day, but he prayed as he walked through the streets, at his work, on his dray, everywhere. His life was a life of prayer, and his words, when he spoke to his friends, were about a better world. Uncle Lawson lived near Master Hugh's house, and becoming deeply attached to the old man, I went often with him to prayer meeting, and spent much of my leisure time with him on Sunday. The old man could read a little, and I was a great help to him in making out the hard words, for I was a better reader than he. I could teach him the letter, but he could teach me the spirit. And high, refreshing times we had together in singing, praying, and glorifying God. Those meetings with Uncle Lawson went on for a long time without the knowledge of Master Hugh or my mistress. Both knew, however, that I had become religious, and they seemed to respect my conscientious piety. My mistress was still a professor of religion, and belonged to class. Her leader was no less a person than the Reverend Beverly Waugh, the presiding elder, and now one of the bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Mr. Waugh was then stationed over Wilk Street Church. I am careful to state these facts that the reader may be able to form an idea of the precise influences which had to do with shaping and directing my mind. In view of the cares and anxieties incident to the life she was then leading, and especially in view of the separation from religious associations to which she was subjected, my mistress had, as I have before stated, become lukewarm, and needed to be looked up by her leader. This brought Mr. Waugh to our house, and gave me an opportunity to hear him exhort and pray. But my chief instructor in matters of religion was Uncle Lawson. He was my spiritual father, and I loved him intensely, and was at his house every chance I got. This pleasure was not long allowed me. Master Hugh became averse to my going to Father Lawson's, and threatened to whip me if I ever went there again. I now felt myself persecuted by a wicked man, and I would go to Father Lawson's, notwithstanding the threat. The good old man had told me that the Lord had a great work for me to do, and I must prepare to do it, and that he had been shown that I must preach the gospel. His words made a deep impression on my mind, and I verily felt that some such work was before me, though I could not see how I should ever engage in its performance. The good Lord, he said, would bring it to pass in his own good time, and that I must go on reading and studying the Scriptures. The advice and the suggestions of Uncle Lawson were not without their influence upon my character and destiny. He threw my thoughts into a channel from which they have never entirely diverged. He fanned my already intense love of knowledge into a flame by assuring me that I was to be a useful man in the world. When I would say to him, "How can these things be, and what can I do?" his simple reply was, "Trust in the Lord." When I told him that I was a slave, and a slave for life, he said, "The Lord can make you free, my dear. All things are possible with him. Only have faith in God. Ask, and it shall be given. If you want liberty," said the good old man, "ask the Lord for it in faith, and he will give it to you." Thus assured and cheered on under the inspiration of hope, I worked and prayed with a light heart, believing that my life was under the guidance of a wisdom higher than my own. With all other blessings sought at the mercy seat, I always prayed that God would, of his great mercy, and in his own good time, deliver me from my bondage. I went one day on the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading a large scow of stone or ballast, I went on board unasked and helped them. When we had finished the work, one of the men came to me aside and asked me a number of questions, and among them if I were a slave. I told him I was a slave, and a slave for life. The good Irishman gave his shoulders a shrug, and seemed deeply affected by the statement. He said it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life. They both had much to say about the matter, and expressed the deepest sympathy with me, and the most decided hatred of slavery. They went so far as to tell me that I ought to run away and go to the North, that I should find friends there, and that I would be as free as anybody. I, however, pretended not to be interested in what they said, for I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape, and then, to get the reward, they have kidnapped them and returned them to their masters. And while I mainly inclined to the notion that these men were honest and meant me no ill, I feared it might be otherwise. I nevertheless remembered their words and their advice, and looked forward to an escape to the North as a possible means of gaining the liberty for which my heart panted. It was not my enslavement at the then present time that most affected me, the being a slave for life was the saddest thought. I was too young to think of running away immediately. Besides, I wished to learn how to write before going, as I might have occasion to write my own pass. I now not only had the hope of freedom, but a foreshadowing of the means by which I might some day gain that inestimable boon. Meanwhile, I resolved to add to my educational attainments the art of writing. After this manner I began to learn to write. I was much in the shipyard, Master Hugh's, and that of Durgin and Bailey, and I observed that the carpenters, after hewing and getting a piece of timber ready for use, wrote on it the initials of the name of that part of the ship for which it was intended. When, for instance, a piece of timber was ready for the starboard side, it was marked with a capital S. A piece for the larboard side was marked L. Larboard forward, LF; larboard aft was marked LA; starboard aft, SA; and starboard forward, SF. I soon learned these letters, and for what they were placed on the timbers. My work was now to keep fire under the steam box, and to watch the shipyard while the carpenters had gone to dinner. This interval gave me a fine opportunity for copying the letters named. I soon astonished myself with the ease with which I made the letters, and the thought was soon present, if I can make four, I can make more. But having made these easily, when I met boys about Bethel Church, or any of our playgrounds, I entered the lists with them in the art of writing, and would make the letters which I had been so fortunate as to learn, and ask them to beat that if they could. With playmates for my teachers, fences and pavements for my copy books, and chalk for my pen and ink, I learned the art of writing. I, however, afterward adopted various methods of improving my hand. The most successful was copying the italics in Webster's spelling book until I could make them all without looking on the book. By this time my little Master Tommy had grown to be a big boy, and had written over a number of copy books and brought them home. They had been shown to the neighbors, had elicited due praise, and were now laid carefully away. Spending my time between the shipyard and house, I was as often the lone keeper of the latter as of the former. When my mistress left me in charge of the house, I had a grand time. I got Master Tommy's copy books and a pen and ink, and in the ample spaces between the lines I wrote other lines as nearly like his as possible. The process was a tedious one, and I ran the risk of getting a flogging for marring the highly prized copy books of the oldest son. In addition to these opportunities, sleeping as I did in the kitchen loft, a room seldom visited by any of the family, I got a flour barrel up there and a chair, and upon the head of that barrel I have written, or endeavored to write, copying from the Bible and the Methodist hymn book, and other books which had accumulated on my hands till late at night, and when all the family were in bed and asleep. I was supported in my endeavors by renewed advice, and by holy promises from the good Father Lawson, with whom I continued to meet and pray and read the Scriptures. Although Master Hugh was aware of my going there, I must say, for his credit, that he never executed his threat to whip me for having thus innocently employed my leisure time. End of chapter 12.